Minasan, Ohio. So, welcome back to Life in Vana'diel, Part 2. Now, in the previous video, I know I mentioned we were going to look more at the world, but I actually want to jump ahead a little bit to another section called Artifact. This section actually goes into the armor sets that were released during this time in the Rise of the Zilart Expansion. So there's a few fun things about this part that I think, I just wanted to share with all of you. First is some information about the different jobs, but also the artwork in this section is really just something nice and something that I really like. So, hope you'll join me for this discussion on the first 6 basic jobs in Final Fantasy XI. So if you enjoyed the last video, please let me know in the comments if this is the kind of thing you guys like. I can talk for hours about Final Fantasy XI, but if this is something you enjoy, please let me know. So let's get started on Artifact. So we start with Warrior. And here's the artwork I told you about, these drawings of the different classes in these sort of action kind of combat poses. Warrior's a bit interesting. Prior to Rise of Zilart, this was really the only tank available in the game. Now, the next class we'll talk about, Monk, could also be used as a tank. It didn't have the defense at all that a warrior had, but warrior was really the primary tank prior to Rise of the Zilart, that expansion. Now, Artifact. If you look here, this is sort of the traditional armor that warrior had, going all the way back to the first Final Fantasy in Famicom, or regular Nintendo NES. You've got that sort of red color scheme along with the armor warrior wears. So that was the Artifact armor. This was job-specific armor released during this expansion for each job. Now, here you've got Fighter's Mask, Fighter's Caligay, Fighter's Mufflers, Lorica, Fighter's Cuisses. Cuisses? Cuisses. And these were generally pretty decent items, though some pieces were not very useful, whereas players might be using them all the way till the level cap at level 75. I'm not very familiar with the warrior artifact gear. I never took a warrior that high. But some interesting things here, though. The warrior's job abilities. Now, warrior was extremely common and useful as a sub-job. Now, in Final Fantasy, you had your main job, but after a quest at level 15, you could equip a sub-job. What that did was it gave you the stats and abilities for that job at half the level of your own job. So, for example, if you had a level 30 warrior and you set your sub-job to monk, as long as you had leveled monk, you would have the stats and abilities of a level 15 monk beside your warrior. So having a sub-job unlocked was a requirement at level 15. Well, not a requirement, but you were extremely weaker than you should be if you did not have a sub-job. So basically, level 30 warrior, if you set monk to your sub-job, you'd have a level 15 monk. And then at level 32, you'd have a level 16 monk, and so on. It was always half of your regular job. So that being said, warrior was extremely useful as a sub-job. Now, as a main job, it could be useful for a tank, but there was other jobs later in the game that became a bit better for that. It was a decent damage dealer. Their A+ weapon, their strongest weapon, was a great axe. Long delay on the weapon, but it had some high damage, so they were decent damage dealers. But what warrior offered as a sub-job were a few things. First, provoke. This was probably the most important ability that only warrior had that made it valuable as a sub-job for other tanks. Provoke was your taunt ability. This was what generated the high aggro, hate, enmity. There's so many different words in different games. Basically got the monster to focus on you as a tank. So Provoke was very useful for warrior. Berserk, I believe, was a single character boost to attack power. When Berserk was used, it only affected warrior, whereas I believe Warcry affected the whole party. I don't remember the level of Warcry, but Berserk was pretty early. I think level 10, I'm not sure. Provoke was level 11 or 12. But these abilities made Warrior a very useful sub-job. Some interesting stuff here. They've got some different weapons and gear listed that were useful for Warrior, but something funny, they're actually showing a Riddle. Riddle was a one-hander sword, which useful for Warrior, but I think Warrior had an A rating in sword, but an A plus in Great Axe. So this wasn't your ideal weapon, but it's funny they're listing Riddle here. This was a very difficult weapon to obtain. If I remember correctly, this was from the Orc HNM, hyper notorious monster in, I believe, Devoy Monastic Cavern, and that enemy took, I believe, 36 to 48 hours to spawn, if that's correct. And then you needed a large party just to take it down. It was an extremely strong enemy, and even then, you weren't guaranteed to get the drop. So for them listing this weapon here, it's kind of funny. This is really a kind of best-in-slot sort of weapon for the warrior. Again, I think warrior's better off with a great axe, but this one here was a good sword. The ability with this was it occasionally attacked twice. What that means is when it procced, in your turn for an attack, you'd get an extra animation and an extra attack, which was actually pretty useful. This was a very rare weapon, so it's funny to see them listing, showing a Riddle here as far as warrior goes. So yeah, that's warrior in their artifact gear, and also some of the abilities that were useful as a sub-job, especially Provoke. Really quick, we're going to be talking about, in each of these jobs, 2-hour abilities. 2-hour abilities were basically that really long cooldown abilities that were really powerful. Some jobs were less powerful than others, but they were usually saved in parties for an emergency. If something went bad, if you got a link, an extra enemy to attack you and it could wipe the whole party, that's when you kept your 2 hours in reserve for. You could pop those and hopefully help you survive. Warrior's 2 hours was Mighty Strikes. This 2-hour ability made every successful hit a critical hit. Now, this did not guarantee a hit, so if you could still miss the monster, but every hit for, I believe, 30 seconds would be a crit, which a warrior using a great axe, several criticals with that puts out a decent amount of damage. So warrior's 2-hour ability was pretty powerful. Really quick note, 2-hour abilities did not transfer over as sub-jobs. The 2-hour ability was only available on your main job. So that's some information about warrior. And now on to monk. Monk, I really don't know much about. I leveled it, I believe, to about 20 because I needed to get my warrior to 37, and I needed this as a sub-job. Monk was famous for having a lot of hit points. That's why they were so good as a sub-job. For warrior, you had the defense of warrior and then the massive hit point pool of monk as sub-job. Their 2-hour ability was 100 Fists. It reduced the delay for monks' attacks, I don't think to 0, but it greatly reduced the delay. So once you popped this, monks just kept swinging. Monks put out a lot of damage. They were good very good damage dealers. They needed to have haste cast on them whenever possible, or advancing march from a bard, because they had, well, sort of a slow delay time with their swings. That's why 100 Fists was such a great ability. Once you pop this, monks just dealt a lot of damage to an enemy, so they were useful for that. But really, I never played much of a monk, and you'd see them in parties occasionally, but there was a lot different damage dealers that players seem to have chosen. This is their artifact gear here: temple gear, temple gloves, cyclist, temple gaiters, crown, temple hose. One thing these were popular for were against skeleton enemies. Basically, monks putting out blunt damage, which skeletons were weak towards. And I believe they also had not an ability, but a trait that, I could be wrong, but they had a trait called Undead Killer. I might be wrong about that. But that basically meant undead enemies would lose an attack turn sometimes. They'd basically say, oh, the skeleton is intimidated by, and then have the player's name, and they would lose their turn. I could be wrong about that, though. But prior to release of Rise of the Zilart in the base game, a lot of XP could be done on skeletons. So for a while, you'd have these all monk parties, not even a single tank, maybe perhaps one healer, and you would just go to a zone and do nothing but fight skeletons. And because monks were so powerful against skeletons, they could get XP just beating on skeletons constantly. In the BG link, the Blue Garter link that I linked in the previous video, I'll link it here as well. When you look at the history of the game, there was actually a joke among the Japanese players that the game should be called Bone Fantasy, because there was a route at the time. You could go from level 1 all the way to level 50, which level 50 was the cap before the release of Rise of Zilart. There was a route to XP on nothing but skeletons, and monks would do that. It was a quick way to do it. It was relatively safe way, so you'd get these entire monk parties just beating on skeletons. And so the joke with the Japanese players was it should be Bone Fantasy. Now on to White Mage, your healer, the classic Final Fantasy healer. Again, I love this artwork here. You've got the mage mid-cast, sort of the spell-casting aura around her. And here you can really see with this artifact armor that traditional sort of design with White Mage, going back to Final Fantasy I on Nintendo, Famicom, and even the Super Nintendo version, Final Fantasy II, which I believe Rosa was the White Mage in that game, and she had this sort of kind of armor design to her, the white with the red. Healer's cap, healer's brialt, healer's mitts, healer's pantaloons, and healer's duckbills. Again, healer, White Mage was even when I was playing the game at level 99, White Mages were extremely common. Very strong healers. All through the game, White Mage was a consistent class. There were other healers introduced, but White Mages were very useful. A few things here with White Mage. White Mage's 2-hour ability, Benediction. You can actually see that here with the rainbow sort of halos with the spell animation. Benediction basically healed the entire party back to full, to 100%. When things were going bad, again, 2-hour abilities were saved for emergencies or, just something that could wipe the party. If things were going really bad, a healer popped Benediction. Now, I believe at higher levels in the game, it did not guarantee 100% healing. I could be wrong about that, but at most levels, if your healer popped Benediction, the entire party was healed to full. Now, this generated a massive amount of enmity, hate with the monsters, the enemies. When a healer popped this, they were most likely going to die. A tank would really have to work hard to get the enemy's attention, to get hate back from the monster once the white mage popped this. So it was one of those things that, the party was probably going to wipe anyway. Maybe the monster was almost dead. So the white mage pops their benediction, heals everybody, and even if they die, the rest of the party lives on, and you try to find a resurrection for the white mage. So that was benediction. A few interesting things here. Auto regen, the trait that mages had, this carried over as a sub job. It was, I believe, 1 hit point per tick, like 1 second. Every second in game, you'd get 1 hit point back. So it wasn't amazing, but it's still better than nothing. Divine Seal, very useful. This doubled the potency of the next healing spell, the next cure. So trying to keep your tank alive, you might use a Cure 2, pop Divine Seal before that. Your Cure 2 now heals twice, twice the hit points that it would have under regular. That was another ability useful, or that carried over to a sub job. I remember on my red mage, I sometimes played with white mage, and if I needed to pop a heal, I would drop Divine Seal, drop a Cure 2 or a Cure 3 for that extra healing ability. And finally, Rize, your res spell. Getting a raise was extremely important in Final Fantasy. In Final Fantasy XI, if you died, you lost a significant amount of XP. That meant time. If you didn't get a raise, if you were forced to HP to return to your home point, you lost, I believe, about half your XP. I'm not sure if that's correct, but especially at higher levels, that could equal hours of grinding. So when you died, you worked hard for a raise. Hopefully you had one around you in your party. There'd be times where people would talk in LS chat. Link shells were like the guilds in Final Fantasy. You might say, hey, can someone come so-and-so, somewhere, give me a raise? Or you might have your party shouting in the zone, we need a raise at, and then you would post your position. And you had an hour, you had 59 minutes from when you died until you would automatically be home ported back and lose that XP. So getting a raise was extremely important in this game, and made white mages even, that much more important. Now again, as a sub job, if you had white mage as a sub, you had access to raise. I can't remember the level, but so even on my red mage, I would be raising people occasionally if I had white mage subbed. White mage was not the ideal sub for a red mage, but we'll get to that later when we talk about red mage. So yeah, that's our white mage. Again, I love this artwork. It's just it's great. The gear here, nothing too special that they show. There wasn't that much. There was decent gear for white mages, but none of it really listed here. And one final thing about white mage that was interesting. White mages had teleport spells. These spells, there were 6 of them in total. A white mage could teleport a party to different wilderness areas around the world. There were 3 near the starting zones. Well, not quite the starting zones, but basically one zone removed. There was a teleport to Lathen Plateau, to Tarongi Canyon, and also to Constant Highlands. And then in the Rise of the Zilart areas, there was one to Vazel, Teleport Vazel, which was in Zarkabard, the snow area in the north. There was one to Altepa Desert. In the previous video, I discussed the Rusty Cap exploit. You could teleport to that area. And the final one was to either Yathunga or Yodor Jungle, the area outside of Kazam, one of the cities I talked about previously. So white mage was useful for that, and you'd even sometimes see white mages shouting in towns for teleport services. Again, traveling around Final Fantasy was time consuming. Everything about this game was time consuming, but if you needed to get somewhere quickly and you didn't have a way, it could take 20 or 30 minutes to get to an area to meet your party. And sometimes you'd have white mages just shouting, teleports, 3,000 gil. They'd basically say all the teleport spells they had, they'd offer a price, and I you'd basically just either send them a message, or even just invite them. And you'd trade them some gil, they'd teleport you somewhere. It was, again, I don't know if it made them lots of money, but, if you were a white mage and didn't have much else to do and were just hanging out, you could just pop that shout every now and then, make a few thousand gil in some downtime. So another interesting thing about white mage, the teleportation services. And from here, we move on to black mage. Another very popular choice for damage dealer. Black mage could put out a lot of damage with their spells. And similar to white mage, all through the different expansions and increase in the level cap, black mage remained a very useful damage dealer. The black mage artifact set, the wizard set, another one that goes back all the way to the design style from the original Famicom game. That large hat, the big poofy pants, the stripes on the pants and the sleeves. If you remember Vivi from Final Fantasy IX, you get that sort of design choice here that was kind of iconic for black mages throughout the game. Bit interesting, they're wielding a fire staff here. The weapon shown in this slot is also an ice staff. These weapons, the ice staff, fire staff, dark staff, wind staff, and so on, these were released, I believe, with this expansion, with Rize of Zilart. These were very useful for spell casting. For a black mage, these helped with damage for your spells. If you cast a fire spell, fire staff would help increase your damage that way. An ice staff would be good for your ice spells. Now, each spell that a black mage got came in different levels. Stone being the lowest, and then I believe wind, ice, fire, and then finally thunder being your strongest spell. And then you'd have stone 2, and then wind 2 or arrow 2, it was called in this game, ice 2, and so on. So they were kind of in different tiers when you got them. But these staves helped with casting. They were also useful for the next job we're going to talk about, a red mage, in that they helped with debuff spells. For example, paralyze, very useful debuff spell from red mages. An ice staff, could help you land that spell. So these were very useful when they were released for casters. Also quite a bit expensive. I believe it was goldsmithing and woodworking, the two crafts required to make them, and these elemental beads were a goldsmithing recipe that you had to craft. So I remember saving up for my first one of these, and they cost me quite a bit. I think it was 100,000 gil, 150,000 gil, which during this time was quite a bit for a low-level player like me to save up. The black mage abilities, again, very popular as a main job and also a sub-job for white mage and red mage. Black mage had the largest MP pool, magic points pool of casters. So if you had this as a sub, you received that bonus from their large MP pool. The 2-hour ability for black mage, Mana Font. This meant spellcasting cost 0 MP. So you could find yourself again in an emergency with the party, and if you were running low on MP and cast this, I believe for 30 seconds, none of your spells cost any MP. So a bit useful. It wasn't that overpowered because your spells still had a long cast time. So while for 30 seconds your spells might not, or they didn't cost any MP, you're still waiting 5 or 6 seconds per cast. So you might only get 4 or 5 spells off while this effect was active, but it was still useful in a pinch. Elemental Seal. This is similar to what we talked about with Divine Seal, doubling the amount of points in a heal spell. Elemental Seal doubled the amount of damage in a attack spell. So again, when this was up, I believe it was a 10-minute cooldown. If you were fighting a mob, an enemy You popped this, cast your strongest spell, and you did double the damage. So quite useful, just as as Divine Seal was for a healer for White Mage. And this also carried over on a sub job. So if you had Black Mage as a sub, you could use this to help put out a little bit more damage. Conserve MP, this was actually a trait. Just as auto regen was a trait on White Mage, this was an always active kind of, well, not an ability, a trait. It didn't need to be activated. It was always there. And what Conserve MP did was occasionally when a spell was cast, the MP amount required was reduced. It didn't proc all the time, but when it did, you basically had a little bit extra MP left over after a spell was cast. I believe it was half. I believe it was half the spell cost, so pretty useful trait to have. Again, this also carried over as a sub-job. Flare. Flare was actually a spell. This was called Ancient Magic. There was Flare, Quake, Flood, and what else? Freeze, and I believe that's it. Yeah. By the way, I forgot to mention, yeah, there was water spells as well in your tiers of casting. It actually went stone, water, air, then ice, fire, thunder as your strongest ones. These had really long cast times. I believe they were 1.5 minutes. It was extremely long cast, very high damage though. Freeze, I remember being a very popular spell in this line of Ancient Magic when XPing during these days. So yeah, that is Black Mage, very popular job choice for a main job and a sub job. And now we come to Red Mage. So Red Mage, this was the first class I took all the way to 75. 75 was again the level cap during Rize of Zilart days. I love this artwork. The Red Mage was one of the classes from the original Final Fantasy on NES or Famicom, where the design, the decoration really stands out. You've got the red color, the hat with the feather sticking from it, and this was a class that in this game, when you had your artifact armor, the full set, it was something that again was really clear to see in the game. The gear for the artifact gear for this class, let's see, the boots and the gloves were the first two. I believe the gloves were at 52 and the boots, no, I had that wrong. I think the boots were at 52 and the gloves at 54. Those were decent, but nothing special. They often were replaced with other items that were better. But at 56, you got the pants, the Warlock tights, or Warlock's tights. These were somewhat useful. I remember the stats being decent on these, but the two best pieces were the hat, the Warlock's chapeau, and the tabard, the body piece and the head piece. These were quite useful. The tabard had fast cast effect. Fast cast was a trait that Red Mages had that basically made their casting faster. They cast spells more quickly. The cap enhanced that. That was the stat on the headpiece, enhances fast cast. I believe it made the fast cast 10% faster, so that was a very useful piece. And then the tabard, the body piece, this was the final piece at level 60, I believe. One of Red Mage's main jobs in the party was debuffing monsters, casting the spells on monsters, debuffs, you know. And the tabard gave plus 10, I believe, to your debuff skill, which was, I don't think you could get that during this time. There wasn't any other gear really easily available that had such stats. So the tabard was worn all the way to level 75. It might be swapped out for some other situational pieces, but for the most part, the tabard was pretty solid. Let's see, 24 2-hour ability. Red Mage's 2-hour ability, Chain Spell. Chain Spell, a very useful spell in basically if there was an emergency situation, if a party was going badly and looked like a wipe, Chain Spell could help in certain ways. What it did, it reduced casting time to 0. That means if you had a spell that took 3 seconds to cast, or if you had a spell such as Rize, which took about a minute, about 60 seconds to cast, the time was reduced to 0. Well, nearly 0. Your character still had to go through the animation of the spell. But basically, once the animation was going, you could move to another spell and then time it and just choose that spell to cast, and you would cast right after. Now, how was that useful? Well, if you needed some raises quick, and if you had a white mage sub, which oftentimes I did, even though black mage was considered the better sub job for a red mage, I had a white mage at times for a sub. And if you needed some quick raises, you could pop Chain Spell and get 2 or 3 raises off within 9 or 10 seconds. Useful in a party if, again, things go south and you've got a lot of dead party members on the floor. So Chain Spell, very powerful spell. I even used this once. We were, I think we were level 75, so my white mage had the teleport spells I mentioned earlier. There were 3 teleport spells you could have as a sub job, and we got in some trouble with something where we weren't going to survive. I think we were trying a very strong NM. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was Circuit, the giant scorpion HNM in the basement of Garlage Citadel. We tried, we were getting nowhere with it, and as people were dying, I got everyone raised up using Chain Spell, and then I teleported us out of there. Again, a teleportation spell to one of the crystals in the outer world, in the overworld. Again, has a good maybe 70-second cast time, if I remember correctly. Chain Spell, boom, got everybody raised, warped us out of there, teleported us out of there, and we didn't die. So that's Chain Spell was quite useful for red mages. Again, we talked about fast cast. That was a trait, faster spell casting. That was just sort of innate. It wasn't an ability that you had to activate. It was always active as a trait. And then Convert. Convert was another very useful skill, or I guess action, that red mages had. This swapped your MP and your HP. So what does that mean? Well, you could basically burn through your entire MP pool, hit Convert, and your hit points now filled your MP. Now, there was a bit of a downside. That means your MP, which could have been down to 30, 20, 10, that's how much hit points you have left. Very vulnerable. You could be killed quite easily. So anytime you converted, that was a very dangerous sort of evolution, a dangerous sort of action. Now, I usually, if I had white mage subbed, I would pop my Divine Seal, so my next healing spell would be doubled, pop Divine Seal, convert, and then instantly throw a Cure 3 onto myself for, it would get me about 50 to 60% hit points. So I wasn't quite full, but it was enough that I could take a few hits if that happened. But yeah, Convert was very useful. It essentially gave red mage every, I believe 10 minutes was Convert's cooldown, basically double the MP. Again, useful in an emergency. In fact, I think that story I told you about fighting Circuit, where I had to raise several people and then teleport us out of there, I think I actually converted in the middle of that as well. Yeah, red mage had a lot of really good abilities. Now, one more thing I want to point out too, similar to War, when I mentioned how they had a really strong weapon in this slot here they mentioned, here they've got a Joyeuse. Joyeuse was, this was a really difficult weapon to get during these days. It was very similar to the riddle that we looked at before, that it occasionally struck twice. In one attack move, you could occasionally get 2 hits. And only a few jobs could equip this. I think it was Red Mage, Bard, Warrior, not many. I think Dragoon could even equip equip it if I remember correctly, but not many jobs could use it. If a red mage got their hand on this, it was extremely useful, because in addition to the healing, the spell casting duties I explained in a party, red mage was also very good for soloing difficult enemies, and there was a lot of different setups with that that we could talk about endlessly, basically. But having a Joyeuse was a very good weapon to have. I didn't get this until level 99. I think in 2018 I finally got this, when it basically was trivial. I was able to walk into where the NM was, completely uncamped, killed it in 3 hits, and got the sword first try, actually. But during this time, it was in Sea Serpent's Grotto, a high-level area with dangerous enemies that you had to go through a very long area with dangerous enemies just to get to the spawn location. I think you even needed a gold coin that you had to trade to a door to get through a certain thing. It was very complicated to get there, and the enemy, I cannot remember his name or its name. It was a Kraken type monster, a big floating octopus. You needed a few people to kill it. It wasn't just a pushover enemy, and then you just had to hope and get lucky for the drop. I do not believe a Joyeuse was a guaranteed drop. I think it was random, but again, funny that they're showing a Joyeuse here. Really a good weapon to have in the game. Yeah, so that is Red Mage, my first 75 job, and the 75 limit break quest, which that's another whole thing we could talk about. This was one of the most difficult in the game. I did it. It took me literally weeks, I'm not exaggerating, to beat Matt, M-A-A-T, and Red Mage had one of the hardest ones, but I was able to finally do it. But yeah, again, great artwork. I love this picture here, and the Joyeuse, that's such a crack up. So yeah, that is Red Mage. Finally, the 6th job in the original basic jobs in Final Fantasy XI, Thief. Thief was an extremely useful party member for a few reasons. First, again, love this artwork, the Mithra Thief in the artifact gear. And a few things. A lot of this gear was very useful in certain situations. Now, one, I can't remember which part. I had a Thief leveled on every one of my accounts. And one of the reasons Thief was so useful was an ability called Treasure Hunter. Basically, Treasure Hunter helped the drop rate for treasure. Now, there was always a sort of a debate about what kind of treasure drops this affected. The devs with Final Fantasy Final Fantasy XI were always extremely cagey with information. They never really explained a lot of things, so that led to a lot of rumors and anecdotal kind of information and evidence, and one of those is about Treasure Hunter. Many people swore that Treasure Hunter did not affect rare gear, the bind on pickup kind of gear. Now, it was called RA/EX in Final Fantasy, RAEX. It was basically, once you picked it up, it couldn't be sold, it couldn't be traded. A lot of people said Treasure Hunter did not affect that it only affected, regular loot. Like if you were fighting a skeleton, for example, there'd be a higher chance of getting, bone pieces from a skeleton. I don't know if that was ever resolved, but a lot of loot was so rare in Final Fantasy that people just insisted on having a thief anyway, just in case Treasure Hunter affected that. And so there were a few pieces of gear, I don't know if it's just one or two, but that actually gave Treasure Hunter +1, which, again, no one ever knew the equations for how that would help loot drops, but having that gear would help. There was some gear with +1 to steal. Thieves could steal from enemies, and now many times this, what could be stolen wasn't that great, but from Beastmen, you could steal coins. And low-level coins were not very valuable, but if you could steal from a higher-level beastman, you could get gold coins. And eventually, I believe, not adamantium, there were platinum coins, platinum. And a stack of those would sell very well. So having +1 to steal helped you with that. In fact, there was a long time where thieves would just sneak around high-level areas, stealing from a mob and then running out to the next zone to let the mob reset and getting a stack of coins that way. So +1 to treasure hunter, +1 to steal, very useful abilities on their armor. Okay, so yeah, here we have steal, the ability that I talked about. Perfect dodge, the thieves' 2-hour ability. What this did was basically for 30 seconds you couldn't be hit by, I believe, only physical attacks. I believe magic spells cast on a thief would still land, but physical attacks would not. Very useful in a pinch. You popped perfect dodge, you had 30 seconds to get away or to hopefully kill the monster. Flee, very useful ability that people kept thief for, just sometimes to get around more quickly. For 30 seconds, your movement speed was doubled. It was a funny little animation seeing your character running on screen at twice their normal speed. But flee, very useful for getting away from an enemy or just being around town. If you were walking around town, pop this every 5 minutes, you could get places more quickly. And then sneak attack. Sneak attack is pretty much the same in almost every game with a rogue or a thief. Basically, when attacking from behind, you get double damage. In this case, you had to actually use the ability. This was not a trait, it was an action. And it was, I believe, every 60 seconds. So you could do this, pretty frequently. In an XP party, you popped this, got behind the mob, and got double damage. So thief was very useful for treasure hunter and so on, but something a bit more complex with this that's not listed: sneak attack and trick attack. Later in the levels with thief, you had another ability that stacked on this called trick attack. Now, sneak attack doubled your damage. So if you used this with a weapon skill, you could put out massive amounts of damage. Again, I apologize, we didn't talk about weapon skills yet. Those are basically, if you remember in Final Fantasy games with a limit break, you had something a bit similar in this with a weapon skill. You had a meter that the more damage you did, it would fill, and once it filled, you had access to several weapon skills. Some were more powerful than others. If you used one with sneak attack, you would put out a lot of damage, but that meant all that damage, you might get the attention, the enmity, the aggro, the hate from the monster, which could kill you. So what you did was you used this with trick attack. What trick attack did was tricked the damage onto another player. So often what you would do is you would, and again, this went away after a while. It was kind of a shame. I used to love doing trick attack. You would save your weapon skill with sneak attack and trick attack, and then get behind the main tank. Now, to get the sneak attack, the monster had to turn his back on you and the tank. It was a very, it wasn't difficult to set up, and most people knew how to do it, but you would basically have someone in the party who would do something to get the monster to turn. So you would get behind the main tank, you'd have your weapon skill ready, this sneak attack ability, and trick attack, and then someone else in the party, usually a Dark Knight or a Samurai or someone else, they would do a weapon skill. This would get the monster to turn towards them, then you would drop this oftentimes very powerful weapon skill at double damage because of the sneak attack, and then trick it onto the main tank. This would turn the monster's attention back to the main tank and basically give them a lot of enmity or aggro, hate. I don't remember what it was called in this game. And it was a useful ability. Again, during the Rise of the Zilart days fighting high-level monsters, tricking onto the tank was a useful way to not only put out a lot of damage with a thief, but to make sure that the hate was stacked on the main tank. So thief was very useful for that, and the positioning with this took a lot of not a lot of planning. Most other damage dealers knew how it worked. So if you often with rangers, like I said, Dark Knights and Samurai, you would tell them, hey, let me know when you're doing your weapon skill so I can trick onto the tank, and they often knew how that worked. And a lot of times in the parties, in XP parties, you would be announcing your attention intentions in chat. There was all these calls and little bells and literally bells and whistles that would make an audible sound to everyone in the party when you were ready for something. So you'd say, okay, hey, there'd be a whistle or a chime. Say my TP is at 100%. I'm going with my attack. Okay, my TP is at 100%, and this was all in chat. Now, eventually, things like TeamSpeak and this was a lot years before Discord, but there were voice, apps, programs that could be used with the game. But for a long time, especially for PlayStation 2 users, everything was done in text. So you would have to announce your intentions and set up this sort of sneak attack, trick attack onto the tank. But Thief, fun job, very useful. I used Thief as a sub job for the times I was farming to make Gil. Early in the days of Final Fantasy, you had to find a niche to make Gil, and mine was simply farming items for crafters and things that sold well in the auction house. By having Thief at 15 as my sub job, helped me get a little more, better drop rate on items to sell. Quick thing here with the some of the items they're showing, the chicken knife. It's funny they're showing the chicken knife. This was a knife that I can't remember what the requirements were for the proc, but it would grant you flee. Remember we talked about flee was every 5 minutes. During a fight, I forget what it was, something that would do, but flee would come up on you, so you could run away from a mob, move more quickly. But yeah, it's funny they listed a chicken knife here. So yeah, that is Thief. So those are the first 6 basic jobs in the game. War, Monk, White Mage, Black Mage, Red Mage, and Thief. Now we've still got the advanced jobs to go over. I'm going to save that for a separate video, but Paladin, again, great artwork here. Dark Knight, Beastmaster, oh, I love that pose. Bard, Ranger, another great bit of artwork. Samurai, Ninja. Dragoon, oh, I'm going to talk a lot about Dragoon. Summoner, another great job. And yeah, that's the 6 advanced jobs, but I'm going to save that for another video. I'll be able to talk a lot about these different classes here. So if you enjoyed this, please let me know if you like hearing more about Final Fantasy XI so I can create more of these videos, and leave me a comment down below. What were your classes, your 75 jobs during the rise of the Zilart era? Drop a comment below and let me know your jobs. So thanks a lot, everyone. Hope you enjoyed.